There's a lot of focus on climate policy again of late. Many on the Green left are using the pandemic now as a reason or an excuse to spend more on renewable energy. Just where the connection is on that, I don't really know. It looks more like political opportunism to me. But Scott Morrison was off spruiking the Snowy Hydro 2.0 scheme today, which is a Malcolm Turnbull hangover and plays into this debate. It's a big worry, actually, Snowy Hydro 2.0 costing up to or beyond $10 billion without generating any extra energy. It'll just store renewable energy for when we need it most. Anyway, amid all this madness, I thought I would share with you a ray of light, a ray of hope. It comes in the form of a lifelong climate activist coming to grips with reality and calling out the blatant alarmism that has come to dominate the environmental debate around the world. Michaeli Schellenberger is his name. He's lobbied on climate action and environmental causes around the world for decades. And today he's releasing a new book called Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Now, I'll show you some of what he's got to say in a moment. Just to give you a sense of how practical and sensible he is, I want to show you what he had to say about the energy debate in a talk a year ago. This too is very relevant to us and makes enormous sense to anyone who wants to reduce carbon dioxide emissions but keep affordable and reliable power.
You might think, well, dealing with climate change is just going to require that we all pay more for energy. That's what I used to think. But consider the case of France. France actually gets twice as much of its electricity from clean, zero-emission sources than does Germany. And yet France pays half as much, almost half as much for its electricity. How can that be? Well, you might have already anticipated the answer. France gets most of its electricity from nuclear power, about 75% in total. And nuclear just ends up being a lot more reliable, generating power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for about 90% of the year.
Okay, just practical, non-ideological facts and common sense there. But Shellenberger has been increasingly concerned about the Green movement, and releasing his new book, he said, on behalf of environmentalists everywhere, I would like to formally apologise for the climate scare we created over the last 30 years. Climate change is happening. It's just not the end of the world. It's not even our most serious environmental problem. Hallelujah. That's a point of view I think we can all deal with. That's the sort of factual basis and rational, calm tone we need to hear more of. There's no doubt practical environmentalism has been overtaken and drowned out by the global warming alarmism of the past decade or so. So Shellenberger's confession, if you like, and his reversion to the cold, hard facts is most welcome. Let me share a list he has made. Some of this is especially relevant to Australia. He says, here are some facts that few people know. Humans are not causing a sixth mass extinction. The Amazon is not the lungs of the world. Climate change is not making natural disasters worse. Fires have declined 25% around the world since 2003. The amount of land we use for meat, humankind's biggest use of land, has declined by an area nearly as large as Alaska. The build-up of wood fuel and more houses near forests, not climate change, explain why there are more and more dangerous fires in Australia and California. Carbon emissions are declining in most rich nations and have been declining in Britain, Germany and France since the mid-1970s. The Netherlands became rich, not poor, while adapting to life below sea level. We produce 25% more food now than we need, and food surpluses will continue to rise as the world gets hotter. Habitat loss and the direct killing of wild animals are bigger threats to species than climate change. Wood fuel is far worse for people and wildlife than fossil fuels. Preventing future pandemics requires more, not less, industrial agriculture. What a list. And of course his book will go into all the detail behind this. But as someone who's read a lot across these issues for decades and interviewed dozens of experts over that time, all those statements ring true. just don't expect to hear much about this from our politicians or our media. Now to more from Michael Schellenberger, the long-time environmental campaigner and climate change activist, once named a hero of the environment by Time magazine. I spoke to him last night about his new book, Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. He joined me via Skype from California. And in the second half of the interview, I asked him about the facts he claims that few people seem to know, such as the fact that climate change is not making natural disasters worse.
This is very important. So I think this is when people think of climate change, they think of the Australian fires last year, flooding, heat waves that kill people, droughts. So I think the most important thing, I mean, if I had two things that people would take away from this book, it would just be that deaths from natural disasters have declined 90% over the last century, during which time population quadrupled, and deaths from natural disasters declined 80% over the last 40 years, including in poor countries, which is just, we should celebrate this, right? No one has heard of this, but this is amazing news. We're getting better at protecting ourselves from horrible events. It's great. The second thing is that carbon emissions have been declining in most rich countries for decades. They've been declining in Britain and France and Germany for since the mid-70s. And that's the same thing that's going to happen in poor countries. They're going to move from coal to natural gas and then to nuclear, and emissions are going to go down. So this is not, things are not going in the wrong direction. They're actually going in the right direction on these two key measures of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. Now, people will say, isn't there some role that global heating has played in extending the fire season in California and Australia? Yes, there is evidence of that. However, it is massively outweighed by two factors: the accumulation of wood fuel in the forests and the development of new houses near forests. And so, is there some contributing role of climate change? Yes. Is it very significant? No. And when you have these debates over whether or not you can detect it, that's just evidence that it's not very significant.
Yeah,
and that's basically the same on all of these disasters.
Yeah, look, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll try and get through some of it. For instance, let's start with the fires. I've been involved in this debate in Australia. We've always had catastrophic fires in our climate and our environment. We always will. I've recognised in writing that climate change can have an influence in that. There's some evidence. But for instance, going back to what you were saying earlier about the scientific pressure or the pressure on scientists, we had our leading expert on drought in this country say there's no link at this stage, no proven link between climate change and the drought that preceded our latest bushfires. And suddenly he was forced to effectively qualify his own statement then and make sure that nobody thought he was questioning the role of climate change. He had to qualify his own factual findings because of the pressure in the debate.
There's a lot of that, and I tell one story. You know, there's so many stories you can tell, and what I wanted to do for the book is to have a set of characters that run through the whole book. And so I have one scientist who I think is the most important scientist who studies trends in natural disasters. His name is Roger Pelkey, and he's a beautiful person in general, a very good person, very good scientist. And he was absolutely pilloried, smeared. There was an orchestrated campaign against him from the White House, which I document in my book. It's not for the first time, but I go into some depth into it. And it's quite unconscionable. It's McCarthyite tactics that they used against him, and it worked. He happily had tenure. He was able to keep his job, but lost a lot of funding and lost a lot of, opportunities to publish and to speak, and it was quite horrible. And so I was very happy to tell that story. I've been collecting other stories like that, including, frankly, defamatory information spread about one of the scientists who talks about the polar bear science. I quibble with some of the things she says, but basically she gets it almost right. And yeah, we hear these stories all the time where scientists are forced to somehow retract factual statements. And obviously we've seen this kind of will to censor and to cancel in other parts of the culture. And I think a lot of it actually began in the climate debates.
After this interview, Michael, I'll send you some material about an Australian professor who lost his job for disputing some of the science around the Great Barrier Reef. But just going on from what you said earlier as well about richer nations reducing their carbon dioxide emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions over recent decades, Australia is, of course, one of those nations as well. We've started to reduce our emissions. Should countries like Australia and those European nations you mentioned be doing more? Because that's what the campaigners are saying. Those rich countries should be reducing their emissions by greater amounts. Do you believe that that's the case?
Well, here's what I think is important, is that everybody understand the simplest mechanism, which is that we want to move from energy dilute fuels to energy dense fuels. That's the same thing as saying we should move from carbon intensive fuels to hydrogen intensive fuels. That's all that matters when it comes to protecting the natural environment and reducing air pollution significantly, are those things. Now you can move to cleaner burning coal plants. I'm not going to say that doesn't matter. In my book, I talk about how it does matter. But those energy transitions, and they go from wood to coal to petroleum to natural gas to uranium, that's very positive. So I think everybody should try to move a little bit quicker along that line. If you care about the natural environment, you're obviously balancing that with economic needs. What's really being said by those people in Australia is the same I said here, which is they're saying you should do more renewables. And they're, in fact, when you say, well, what about doing more nuclear? They say, oh, heavens, no, we can't do more nuclear. And I make a lot of that in the book. In fact, this book is, in many ways, has nuclear at the heart of it. I was obsessed with this question of why, if you think climate change is the end of the world, are you against all of the most important solutions to it, which is basically moving from coal to natural gas, which is what Australia is doing, or moving from coal and natural gas to nuclear.
Well, it's one of the few issues.
So many other countries are doing.
If you talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions as being the prime aim, then surely it's one of the few problems where there is actually a silver bullet, that is nuclear energy.
Of course, and not only that, but everybody knows it, and we've been talking about it for years. I mean, I remember as an anti-nuclear progressive or lefty, hearing about France and being like, well, that's weird, because I thought that nuclear was right-wing, but sounds like France is pretty socialistic. I mean, they've socialized medicine and they have socialized energy, and they're very left-wing people. They protest everything all the time.
Yes.
And I remember being like, well, maybe nuclear is not this left-right thing. Maybe nuclear is just better. And so what I wanted to get to the bottom of is, who are the people that are so threatened by nuclear? What is it that they're threatened by? And what it is that they're threatened by is that if you have nuclear, then we're never going to run out of anything. You have infinite energy, infinite water, infinite fertilizer, infinite food. There is no energy scarcity with nuclear. It's functionally infinite. So if you're somebody that wants to take control of big sectors of the economy by being alarmist about climate change, nuclear is a problem for you. And you have to find some way to demonize nuclear, which is what they've done. And it's very easy to do it because you just make people think about nuclear weapons. That's all they do.
Finally, Michael, I wonder if you can sum up in your book, are you optimistic that the climate change debate can become more rational, more logical, and look for more practical outcomes like nuclear energy? And also, along the way, can we find the time in the environmental debate to focus on the other issues like preserving species by preserving their habitat, or stopping river pollution and those other environmental issues that seem to have been put on the back burner by so many people?
Well, yeah, I mean, I mentioned that I testified in front of Congress, and I was expecting the Republicans to start talking about sunspots, or about how the world's not really warming, or about how carbon dioxide is not really a molecule that warms the atmosphere, and nobody said that. I think that's pretty marginal stuff, honestly, and I think that most Republicans want to move away from that, are moving away from that, and do care about wildlife. I mean, the people that are fighting these horrible industrial wind turbines in the United States and Europe and Australia tend to be more right of center. They tend to be people who love hawks and eagles and owls and bats and all the wildlife that are being killed by industrial wind turbines. So I do think there's a possibility of more of a center-right environmental movement that understands that climate change is not the most important environmental issue, that the most important environmental issues are other than those that do include questions of wildlife and habitat. And that also by having a more moderate position on climate change, I think it'll be harder for the radical left to demonize people on the right as deniers.
Michael, good luck with the book. It's called Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Last night I introduced us to Michaeli Schellenberger, who's a long-time environmental campaigner and climate change activist who was once named a hero of the environment by Time magazine, no less. But he's now apologised for climate alarmism, promoting a less catastrophic and a more rational approach to environmental issues. And he's detailed this in a new book, Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. This is so confronting for some, apparently, that the Forbes website, which published Shellenberger's opinion piece about his book, then decided to pull it down. Censorship in action. That was yesterday. Now, we won't censor him. The activist and author joined me from California earlier today. Michaeli Schellenberger, thanks so much for joining us. How does someone go from being a Time magazine environmental hero to apologising for climate alarmism?
Well, I've been working on environmental issues for a really long time. 33 years as an environmental activist. I've been a climate activist for 20 years. I've seen a lot by now, and I know the science well enough to know that climate change is not a catastrophic threat. I kept waiting for climate scientists to speak out against the alarmism, these apocalyptic, the world's going to end, billions will die, all that stuff last year. Nobody did. I think it's actually quite irresponsible that nobody did. And I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and while she's fine because I talked to her about the science, I explained the science to her, her friends are very alarmed and very anxious, and they've been misinformed. And, adolescents these days, they have a lot of things to worry about. Anxiety and depression are rising among everybody, really, certainly among adolescents. And I thought it was not right to be terrorizing, school children and giving them false information. I felt like somebody needed to separate out science from science fiction.
Yeah, to make it clear here, you're certainly not a climate denier. You're certainly not talking down the issues of climate change and global warming and the fact that you want to see action, but it's that alarmism, that catastrophism that you're railing against.
That's right. I mean, I'm quite proud of the fact that I'm asked to testify before a number of different governments. I testified in front of the Congress in January. I was invited by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to become an invited expert reviewer late last year. And I know for a fact that there are people that are involved in IPCC who are also bothered by the alarmism and wanted to see some pushback to that and some better communications of this. And so I felt emboldened that I needed to speak out, and I think that the majority of scientists are not activists. There's actually just a handful of scientists that feel the need to terrify people, and I go into sort of what are their motivations in the book as well.
Well, do you think that the whole global climate change movement, the global campaign, if you like, has turned its back on rational thought and logical debate and has gravitated towards emotive posturing?
Well, it's a question of whether there was ever something called the environmental movement that was rational. I mean, there was something we called a conservation movement, which was focused on protecting wildlife and the habitats that they occupy. That existed up until about 1970, at which point this anti-human Malthusian tradition took over, and it's the paranoid side of environmentalism. It's this neurotic concern with having your body be poisoned. It really had more to do with fear of nuclear weapons, but it also had to do with some kind of first world problems of neurosis and paranoia and really radical left thinking. I think everybody kind of knows what we're talking about here, and that really took over the conservation movement, which was a very humanistic and rational movement up until around 1970. So for me, I don't think this is really that complicated. I think we need to lift everybody out of poverty, and we need to do our best to protect natural places. And things have just spiraled out of control. I mean, this climate change thing, it's just got too crazy, you know, and somebody had to say something. And I just was at this point in my career, I was like, if I don't do it, I just know that nobody else is going to do it.
So much of what you say rings true to me. I'm someone who started off my career in wildlife and park management, so I understand that mentality, looking to save species, preserve habitat, do those practical things, and that seems to have been drowned out now by climate alarmism and nothing else in the environmental movement. Without criticising Greta Thunberg specifically, I'm more interested really in the people who use her as figurehead. Does she sort of personify this movement where people are more interested in fear-mongering and publicity, if you like, rather than the rational discussion and the hard work of actually improving the environment?
Well, that's right. I mean, there's a really dark tradition which views there being too many people in the world. They say humans are a cancer. We heard this recently with the coronavirus, that humans are a virus. And it's a sense in which humans don't belong here, you know, that we're aliens on this earth, that we've really violated natural laws, and we're destroying our habitat. You know, I think it's telling you, I think, to the question of who is, you know, you say manipulating. I mean, in some ways, I think people are in the grip of a religion. And so the final part of the book looks at the money, power, and religious motivations of apocalyptic environmentalists. And ultimately, I think these are people who themselves feel very alienated, feel very socially isolated. I think there's a lot of anxiety and depression behind apocalyptic environmentalism. It really doesn't have anything to do with concern over the environment. I mean, I'm always struck. My book is full of stories about gorillas and whales and penguins and other endangered species. I'm always struck that these books about climate change, they don't really have much to say about nature at all. It's really about establishing a new morality of not eating meat, of not using plastic, of not driving or not flying. And I think that stems from this vacuum, which comes from people just not believing in the Judeo-Christian religion anymore and needing a different kind of faith.
Well, how is it then that someone who's not a scientist, who's not even really previously been a public figure, someone like Greta Thunberg, can become the personification of this campaign?
Well, that's a very interesting question. You know, one question I didn't get to the bottom of in this book, and I don't think I felt like it was a super high priority, was just, why is the climate movement being led by a 17-year-old? What is that saying? I'm very careful. I have a 14-year-old daughter. I'm very careful with Greta Thunberg. I'm very careful about not assuming I understand her motivations. And so the last chapter of the book, I sort of turn the critique back on myself, and I just ask, why was I apocalyptic? And the answer I come up with, and I'm spoiling the book a little bit for your readers, I hope they'll buy it anyway, was that a lot of my apocalyptic mentality just had to do with some unhappiness in my own life, and it didn't really have anything to do with climate change.
Yeah, I think there's an element of teenage angst there too. But as you say, we don't want to presume what other people's motives are. But certainly, as a teenager too, I had similar thoughts, especially related to nuclear war and the like. And I think we're seeing that across the community now. You call the book "Apocalypse Never." That seems to be a very optimistic outlook. But you talk about how climate alarmism does hurt us all. How is it actually hurting us now?
Well, it hurts us in a lot of different ways. I think obviously the climate alarmism has been hurting adolescents in particular. I think it's very hard to be an adolescent right now, particularly for girls, particularly the relationship to social media. It sort of magnifies some social behaviors in adolescents that I think are unhealthy. And then you go add the sense in which they may not have a future. I think it's very depressing. You know, Greta Thunberg herself, and I do describe this, she says she was made depressed, and she might have been depressed for other reasons, but was also made depressed by being taught about climate change, including the very misleading story of polar bears, which I tell. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think that it hurts, obviously, our mental health. But then I think the thing that really drove me to write this, too, was that I'm very bothered that the Greens in the West, the center-left and left coalition, have basically made the World Bank stop funding development. So they used to fund roads, electrical grids, indoor plumbing, flood control systems, hydroelectric dams, and now they fund democracy workshops and empowerment workshops and solar panel and battery hookups for remote villages. The way that everybody climbs out of poverty is the same. We go from being subsistence farmers to living in cities and being modern people. And what the World Bank is basically doing is funding programs to make poverty sustainable rather than to make poverty history.
Now, you penned a piece, I suppose, introducing your book or summarising your book and apologising for the climate alarmism you've been involved in the past. It was published on the Forbes website. It's published today in the Australian newspaper on the front page. I recommend anybody read it if they haven't so far. But Forbes stripped it. They've pulled it down. Are they censoring you? What's the explanation here?
Well, yes, they took it down. So they obviously censored it. What I'll say is that I have very much enjoyed being a contributor to Forbes. They have mostly allowed me to publish report on the news and the facts as I discover them. And I am going to continue to write for them on energy and the environment. I'm not going to write in the first person anymore for Forbes. I'll do that for other publications. But I think that's all I'll probably want to say about that incident. But like you said, people can read the article in other outlets now.